today's video, I will be showing you step by step how to prepare your residential purchase agreement through the Quantum forms and how to fill out every single section, including this section, the very important section, on how you get paid and the concessions that you're going to be requesting for your client. And other than that, for the most part, it's still the same, but we're still going to cover each section one at a time. So with that being said, let's get started. So as you see here on the screen, I already have the transaction cover sheet already added, and you see here that I also have the residential purchase agreement already added to that as well. So everything that I type into this cover sheet is automatically going to populate to my purchase agreement and any other forms that I add to it as well. Okay, well, let's get started here. I have my buyer, my hypothetical buyer, Mr. John Doe. All I really need to put in here is his name and his email. And the email is for purposes of e-signing. If I'm planning on just printing this out, all I really need to do here is have his name so it shows up on the contract the right way. Make sure it's his full name, the way that it shows up on his driver's license, and his email address so that it knows where to send out the e-signatures. Okay? If there was a secondary buyer, I would put that in here. Let's put Jane Doe, and Jane Doe has an email address as well. So I got my two buyers right there. Okay, so we'll leave that blank. Here you're going to enter the property address information. Let's do that here. We'll do this one, 1234 Anywhere Street, City, Rancho Cucamonga, right, California, 91730. So there's our property address right there. Real simple. I can even put in here the purchase price. Let's say I want to make an offer for $500,000. I could do that right there too. Residential. I don't really have to put in anything else really. Okay. Escrow information. I can just leave it there. Seller's choice of service. And here you can actually add the seller's information here too. So let's say ABC broker. All right. Of course, you would find this on the MLS. And agent's name will be John Listing Agent. And you put their DRE number in there as well. Make sure you put the broker's DRE number information there. Fill out all their information as to where this broker is. You should be able to find this in the MLS. Should be easy to find. Using Corona, right? I don't know what the Corona zip code is, but something like that. So if you have all this filled in, then later on when you go to your California residential purchase agreement, all this information will already be populated for you, and it'll be pretty easy. All right, so bare minimum that you guys got to have in here for this purchase agreement is the names of your clients with their email addresses. All right, the property address. You can put in the price if you want to, but really your information, the broker's, the listing agent's information, you should have it in there as well with their phone numbers and email addresses. Right. That way it builds it all out for you. All right, and then you can just jump over to California Residential Purchase Agreement. And as we scroll down, you can see that our information is already populated through this form, right? So we got my buyers are already there. Our information, myself, is already there with the licensing information is already filled in. So that's kind of like the advantages of using the cover sheet. It makes this very easy for you. As we're scrolling down, here we finally get to our RPA, our Residential Purchase Agreement. Okay, it's got the date already populated through since I used the cover sheet. My client's information is already there. Here's the information regarding the property that we're going to be acquiring, already filled in. I didn't fill in the parcel number on the cover sheet. I could have done that as well, so I would have gone to the cover sheet here and put in the APN number that you can copy from the MLS, right, it'll automatically populate that through. So reminder to put the APN number in there, and then it'll make your job easier here when you go to the RPA. Okay, so now our APN number is already filled in as well, right there. Seller's brokerage, you got this is the listing agent's information, so the listing agent's broker with their license number, the listing agent's name with their license number. Here's our information since we're representing the buyer in this transaction, Stigler Homes, Kenny Stigler with our respective licenses. All right, moving along. Just like we used the cover sheet to fill in the price, so there's your purchase price right there. Right? If this is an all cash offer, you can fill in all cash. Most of the time, your client's going to be using a loan more than likely. Right? How many days do you want on escrow? These are pretty self-explanatory stuff, right? So close of escrow, let's just say we want 30 days. We're checking that. Right? Or you can click on a specific date too. You can put a specific date in there as when you want it to close, right? But for the most part, you can pick a number of days as well. It's totally up to you, right? Usually picking a specific date, it solves the issue sometimes of any confusions that might arise. Like, how many days are we counting, and how are we counting the days? Like, if you want to avoid that, just put a specific date in there, right? Expiration of offer. Typically, the standard default on this thing is that when you write an offer, your offer expires within 3 days after your client sign it, or you can change that, right? Up to you right there. That way, if they don't respond to you by a certain amount of time, your offer automatically expires. It doesn't stay open in perpetuity. It automatically withdraws itself, basically, if they don't respond to your offer. Okay. Next line over here, initial deposit. This is where you put down the money that your client's willing to open with on their EMD. So let's say I want to do $10,000. On average, it's about about 2% of the purchase price. Okay, and in this case, that's why I put $10,000, which is exactly 2% of the $500,000 purchase price. Okay, right here, you're saying that within 3 days or after acceptance by wire, when is this money supposed to be due? Okay. Next line over here, if there's any increased deposits, most of the time I don't think anybody really runs into that too often. But depending on the situation, there could be an additional deposit after a certain amount of time. Right here is where we talk about loan amounts. So if I was doing, in this particular case, a 10% down loan, right? Well, 10% would be $500,000 would be $50,000. So my loan amount would be $450,000. So I would put here a new first loan of $450,000, right? Which is 90% of the purchase price, right? Subtract 10%, so you got 90% left, right? Is it going to be a fixed rate, or is it going to be an adjustable rate? You can mark those things. You can mark, if you don't mark any boxes over here, they're going to assume it's a conventional loan, okay? Unless you mark down that it's an FHA loan or a VA loan, right? Or even like there's some kind of like DSCR loans or non-QM loans, you can mark that here, and you can fill in the blank like non-QM. You can do that. Talk to your lender, and they can tell you more specifically, is it just a conventional transaction or is it an FHA? Should be on your pre-approval, by the way. You just look at that, okay? You don't have to get too particular with filling in, okay, what's the rate going to be? How many points are they paying? You don't need to get too particular about that. If this right here, it says that if FHA or VA is checked. So if you check that there's an FHA or VA loan, right here it's asking you to deliver the list of lender required repairs. This actually is true for any type of loans, guys. Any type of loans might create a list of lender required repairs, okay? So it's not just VA or FHA, okay? But this is all part of your loan contingency as well, okay? But right here, if it says VA or FHA, it's giving you 17 days after acceptance to deliver your list of lender required repairs. And that is going to come off of the appraisal. So if the appraiser goes out there, inspects the property, and it finds out that, the roof is messed up, they're going to give you the appraisal, but they're also going to say subject to roof repairs. And then once the lender sees that, the lender's going to be like, okay, in order for us to do this loan, the roof needs to be repaired and inspected by a certified roofer. It's going to be something like that. Moving along here. This is if there's any additional financing apart from that. That would be if there was a first loan or a second loan, if there was a second loan attached to it, but most of the time that's not happening right now. But if there was, this is where there was any additional financing would be right there, if there was a second loan. Occupancy type. Occupancy is assumed to be primary unless you check one of these boxes, whether it's a secondary home or an investment property. Okay, moving along to page 2 of the RPA. So it starts off at the top with a seller credit to the buyer. By the way, this little section right here, guys, where we're talking about seller credits and seller payment for buyer's obligation to compensate buyer's broker, this has just recently been updated as of the end of December 2024. So just a slightly different piece right here. Everything else for the most part has stayed the same in this update. But we're starting here at the top, right? Right here in this little spot is where you're going to fill in for where you're requesting for the seller to contribute towards closing costs for your buyer. And what they mean by closing costs is everything with the exception of any type of compensation to you as the buyer's agent. Okay, so this could be escrow fees, title fees, prepaid taxes and insurance, any lender fees, appraisal fees, everything, any other fees that the buyer has to bring in to close this transaction, with the exception of any type of compensation, all right, is what they're going to consider closing costs. Okay, so any amount that you want for that, you fill it in this section right here. In this case, we put in $10,000. Now, if I also want the seller, right, as part of this, accepting this offer, if I also want the seller to contribute to and pay for the buyer's obligation to compensate their agent, I need to check off this little box right here. Okay, and this is where I fill it in. Let's say it's 3%, that I want the seller to contribute towards 3% of the buyer's obligation of the purchase price. I fill that in right there. And right here, the buyer is signing off and stating that at the time that this offer is made, that they do have that buyer has a written contract, a written agreement with the buyer's agent. In this case, it would be me. That is valid and it covers the property and it provides for compensation, no less for the amount stated. Okay. Now, if you have a buyer's obligation, if you have a buyer's contract for 2% and you asked for 3%, okay, you'd basically be lying, okay, because you don't have a contract that says that they owe you 3%. If your contract with your buyer is 3%, I mean only 2%. All right, you have to match. You can't ask for more than what you've already agreed with your buyer. You could ask for less, right? So if I have a contract with my buyer where my buyer is supposed to pay me 3%, but I'm only requesting 2% from the seller, that's okay, right? What is not okay is that you're asking for more from the seller as a contribution than what you have in writing between you and your buyer, right? So if between you and your buyer you have an agreement for 2% in compensation, you cannot ask for 3%, all right? Your buyer would be basically committing a type of fraud if they sign off on that, because they're stating right here and they're signing off that the buyer affirmatively represents that at the time this offer is made, the buyer has a written agreement with the buyer's broker that is valid and it covers the property and provides for compensation for no less than the amount stated above. Okay, so don't ask for more than what you have in writing with your client, but you can ask for less than what you have in writing for your client, FYI. Okay, moving along. Oh, then there's also, if you notice that there's no SPBB form, so there's nothing in here that says that you have to provide the listing agent a copy of the agreement that you have between you and your client anymore. Okay, it does not have that as a requirement anymore. Where before, if you ask for anything from the seller, you kind of have to give them a copy of your buyer representation agreement so that they can see how much money is owed to you from your buyer. It is no longer a part of the transaction for that to happen anymore. Okay, moving along. This part, if you had an all cash offer, if you ended up selecting this box up here for all cash, then in this section right here, you're basically saying the default setting is that you have verification of all cash. You have proof of funds that are attached to your offer. If for some particular reason your client hasn't given you proof of funds, you can say that, hey, I'll give it to you within 3 days or X amount of days, where you can put it in there, up to you. Of course, most of the time, guys, if you're making an all cash offer, your listing agent, the seller, they're probably not going to take your offer seriously if your proof of funds isn't already attached to the offer, which is why this is the default setting here. Okay. If your buyer has a loan, then this section right here, verification of down payment and closing costs, this is where you're submitting proof of funds, right? Showing that you have enough money for the down payment and to close on this transaction. And the default setting is that it's attached to the offer. But for some particular reason, your buyer hasn't given it to you and you want to submit this offer without it, you're at least saying that you're going to get it to them within 3 days if you check that box, or any X amount of days after that. It's up to you. Obviously, once again, that makes your offer weaker, right? Verification of loan application. That's pretty much your pre-approval letter, your pre-qual letter from the lender, right? Normally, by default, you would have this attached to your offer, right? Because obviously that makes your offer more, stronger in the eyes of the seller. So normally your proof of fund, your pre-qual, your pre-approval letter, all right, or your underwriting approval would be attached to the offer, right? Makes you have a stronger offer. But if for some reason you didn't have it, then right here you can select that you want at least 3 days before you have to submit it, or X amount of days before you do have to submit it. Okay. Moving along, this final verification of condition, that's how many days before you have to do the walkthrough. So within 5 days prior to closing, this is stating that you're going to be doing your final walkthrough, or you can change it. Okay. Assignment of request. Most of the time, this is not going to apply to you unless you're, flipping homes. But assignment is basically when you're assigning the right to buy this property to somebody else, right? So let's say initially, John Doe is buying this house, and for some particular reason, maybe he couldn't qualify, maybe he didn't have the money, but he doesn't want to lose out. He can basically say, hey, you know what? I'm not going to buy this house, but I want to assign this contract to my brother, and he's going to buy the house. You could do that. That's an assignment. Of course, the seller has to approve that, right? So it's an assignment request. So now you know what an assignment is. And basically it's saying that if you were going to do an assignment request, that you're not going to do it, that you have 17 days after acceptance to be able to request an assignment. Okay. Like I said, most of the time that's not going to apply to you unless you're doing a lot of house flipping and things like that. That's usually when that's done. Okay. Loan contingencies. There are 3 major contingencies on your offer, guys. You have your loan contingency, your appraisal contingency, and your property investigation contingency, right? Your home inspection contingency, if you want to call it that. The loan contingency is usually the one that is the riskiest to remove, guys. I'll talk about the appraisal and property investigations. Those are a lot easier to remove, right? Once your buyer has done all of their inspections, right, their home inspection, maybe they want to do a termite inspection, maybe they want to do, a mold inspection, maybe they want to have their priest come look at the house and make sure that it's not haunted or something, anything, okay? Their feng shui person, any kind of investigation, as long as it's not, intrusive and they're not breaking down walls or anything, the buyer's pretty much allowed to do, right? Once they're satisfied with all of their investigations, it's pretty easy to remove that contingency, right? And it's letting the seller know that, hey, the buyer's not going to cancel because of some silly thing like, hey, you know what, I kind of changed my mind, I don't like the color of the carpet. It's not going to allow them to cancel for silly things anymore. They've already had time to investigate the property. They've already had time to, to settle in about whether or not they're okay with the way this property looks and the roof and everything like that. And so once they've removed, they've done all their investigations, there should be okay with removing that contingency without really any risk to them. Okay. Same thing with the appraisal. The appraisal contingency is there to protect the client in case the property doesn't appraise at the contracted price, right? So in this particular case, they're buying this house for $500,000, and so we want to make sure that the appraisal, right, states that the property is worth at least $500,000. You know, if the property only appraised for $450,000, let's say, now the buyer is going to have an issue. I'm like, oh, they offered $500,000, but it turns out the house is only worth $450,000. The appraisal contingency allows the buyer to back out and from this agreement, from this contract, simply because the property didn't appraise to the contracted price, which of course, for the most part, would also make it a lot more difficult for them to get a loan, since all of a sudden now the lender is not going to loan them up to a value of $500,000. It's only going to loan them up to a value of about $450,000, right? If they came in short, and now the financing got more difficult. They would have to basically come in with more money as cash if they wanted to continue to buy the property. So having the appraisal contingency in effect allows them to cancel in the event that the property doesn't appraise. And so, of course, it's a very safe contingency to remove once you see a copy of the appraisal. Once you know what the appraisal comes in at, right, and if it matches the purchase price, it's a very easy contingency to remove, right? But the one contingency, guys, that as agents, I never want you to recommend to your buyer to remove, and it's the riskiest one, is the loan contingency, guys. Even though this contract's here by default, in this case, let's say, it says that you're supposed to remove your loan contingency within 17 days, right? As long as the buyer doesn't actually remove it in writing, that loan contingency stays in effect, right? And so let's pretend 17 days passes by. Your buyer needs to remove their loan contingency. If the seller's agent recognizes that they haven't removed their loan contingency yet, they're going to send out a notice to perform. And they have to wait 3 days. And if your buyer still doesn't remove their contingency, the loan contingency, let's say, if that's the one we're talking about, then technically the seller can now cancel this transaction, right? Or they choose not to cancel this transaction. And if they choose not to cancel this transaction, the loan contingency is still in effect. Your buyer simply just hasn't removed the loan contingency, and the seller has chosen not to cancel. They could have, but they chose not to. So we're still moving forward, and the loan contingency is still in effect. And guys, as agents, I never want you to recommend to your clients that they remove this contingency, because you don't know what you don't know. Even though they've gotten a full loan approval from the bank, right, that says, yeah, this loan's pretty much a done deal, right? You don't know what you don't know, right? What if on the day that they're supposed to fund this loan, practically on the last day when you're about to fund and record this deal, your buyer gets a phone call, or they go to work and they get called into the boss's office and they get fired. They didn't know that was going to happen. Nobody saw that coming. You didn't see that coming. But all of a sudden, your buyer no longer qualifies for a loan because they don't have a job, they have no income. And one of the last things that the lender does is before they go fund a loan is they call your client's job and, hey, does John still work there? And if somebody on the phone tells them that he doesn't work there anymore, he just got laid off, then there's no deal. And now if you remove that loan contingency, your buyer is unable to get their EMD back. They pretty much lost their money. And so you don't want to be the agent that told your client that they should remove their loan contingency, and then later on, they end up losing their EMD because of the advice that you gave them. You don't want to put yourself in that position. So you should never recommend it, right? What you should do as an agent is simply tell them what the contract says they're supposed to do and what will or will not happen if they do or do not do it, right? So you can say, Mr. Buyer, Mrs. Buyer, the contract says that you're supposed to remove your loan contingency, right? If you choose not to do it, they can cancel, and you may lose the opportunity to buy this house. If you do remove your contingency, it basically makes it so you can't get your money back if for some particular reason you're unable to close on this loan, and so your deposit is at risk, right? What would you want to do, right? And so you have to leave it up to them, right? And if they do decide to remove their loan contingency, you should have an email or a text saying to them that, hey, it kind of goes against your best recommendation, that they're putting their deposit at risk, right? That way, if anything does go sideways, they have it. You have something in writing that says, hey, you know, you didn't recommend them to do that. That you told them that it was probably not a good idea. Okay. Very important, guys. You got to make sure that you're careful with these contingencies. I created another video specifically about how to deal with contingencies so that you're protecting your buyer's earnest money deposit at all times. Okay. And I recommend that you guys watch that video as well. Okay. But moving along here. The default settings on these contingencies is 17 days. There's a reason for that, right? But a lot of times the listing agent is going to counter you back and try to shorten those periods, right? They're going to shorten those investigation periods so that it's forcing your client to speed up, and it doesn't allow them to change their mind, you know, because they decided that they don't like the color of the carpet or something like that. They're trying to tie them down into the contract. They're trying to get them to, same thing with the appraisal contingency. Don't be surprised if you get a counter offer that says appraisal contingency to be 10 days, right? They're trying to shorten that down so that you don't have that much time, okay? Same thing for loan contingency. They're trying to get you to probably reduce that down too. But like I said, be very careful with those contingencies. You do not want to put your client in a position where they could lose their money, okay? Unless it's their choice. And it's their choice even though you never recommended that. You actually told them all the things that could possibly go wrong, okay? Moving on to the other steps. These are all by default 17 days, or they have 17 days to get an insurance quote, 17 days to review all the seller's documents, 17 days to review the prelim, you know, any other disclosures. So the 17 days is the standard. They also have a spot right here where you can select that they can actually waive all of their contingencies and remove all of their contingencies. And guess what, guys? Yes, that makes your offer a much stronger offer, but you as an agent should never tell your client that it's a good idea to do that. They may still want to do that because maybe they really want this house and they want to give the seller an awesome, amazing offer, right? It's like, hey, no contingencies, all cash. They may want to do something like that. But you should, as an agent, never recommend that to your client. And if your client ever decides to make an offer where they're removing their contingencies or submitting an offer with no appraisal contingency or no loan contingency, that you should have something in writing where you're letting them know, like, hey, you know, this is usually not a really good idea. Yes, it makes your offer a strong offer, but you're also risking your deposit. Just wanted to let you know that it's not something that I typically advise. That's always best practice, the thing that you want to have, so that your client later on can't blame you and say, hey, you know what? You told me that I should remove my contingencies, right? You never want to have anything like that. Moving along for possession. Time of possession, right? Normally you're thinking that you should get the keys for your house on the house on the day it records, right? Maybe yes, maybe no, right? And it really depends on, you know, is the house vacant? Is it not vacant? Right? If it's vacant, then you should probably be able to get the keys on the day it closes, right? And you should put that in here upon recordation. That's the default setting, right? But you may have to make an adjustment if it's still occupied, right? Is the seller going to be able to move out on the day it closes? Or do they have the money to move out ahead of time, right? If they're not going to be moving out at closing, if they're not going to be able to hand over the keys at closing, how many days are they going to have, right? If they're going to be staying there longer, should you have an agreement in escrow where you're holding back money? Because once it closes, now it's your client's money. Now it's your client's house. What if you gave them an extra 3 days for free and they end up damaging that house during that time and they just leave? Now you have nothing for your client to protect them in the case that happens. So whenever you have a situation where the seller is not vacating when it closes and not handing over the keys when it closes, you need to have something in writing where your client is compensated for the days that they stay beyond closing, and also some type of security deposit in case there's any damages. And those should be held by escrow, and you should have something in writing for that, guys. I should always caution you guys about that. Okay, but this is the time of possession area. If the property is occupied by tenants, you're going to select this box. An additional form will be added to this contract. This is a section with regards to delivering documents. These are basically time frames for the seller. So the seller has, by default, 7 days to deliver all of their disclosures. They have 5 days to sign and return any of the escrow documents. They have 3 days to pay for any of the HOA fees, 7 days for installing smoke alarms and carbon monoxide and water bracing, right? And 3 days to provide any evidence of representative authority in case, like, you know, this house is under a trust or anything. It's providing proof that they're able to sign for the trust or something like that. That's the evidence of representative authority. Okay, so that's pretty much everything here on page 2, guys. Like I said, the big change on this page is really this top section with regards to the seller credit to the buyer and the seller payment for buyer's obligation to compensate the buyer's broker. Okay, moving along to page 3. This part's really important, guys. We're talking about what's included, what's not included with the house. Going back to your studies for your license, right? If it's attached to the house, if it's permanently attached to the house, it goes with it, right, at the sale. So a microwave that is installed in the kitchen is part of the sale, right? As opposed to a microwave that is sitting on the countertop, that's just personal property, and that doesn't go with the seller property, right? Same thing with a refrigerator. If it's a custom installed refrigerator, that goes with the property, as opposed to a refrigerator that was just placed there. That's personal property, right? And so if your client wants a piece of personal property, like a refrigerator that's right there, or a washer and dryer, right? And those things aren't installed into the house, they were bought and just placed there. That's personal property. And if your client wants that, they specifically have to ask for it here. Like, for example, like, oh, I want the microwave, or I want the washer and the dryer, or I actually want the refrigerator. And you're making that part of the sale, right? Keep an eye on the stoves too, right? If it's built-in, it's a built-in countertop stove, well, that's staying with the property. But if it's not built-in, if it's just one of those ones that you just push in, then you have to ask for it. Otherwise, they could take it, and your client shows up on the day that they get their keys, and they're like, "Hey, where's the stove?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, that wasn't included." And you're looking at your contract. "Oh, I didn't check the box," and they took the stove. You know, they're going to be blaming their agent probably as to, like, "Hey, how come you didn't negotiate that for me? I thought we were getting the stove." You know, your clients don't know this stuff, right? So they're always going to want to blame you for something, right? So ask them when you're writing these offers, "Hey, I saw that there was a stove in there. Do you want that? I saw that you like that refrigerator that's not installed there. Do you want to ask for that? Are you okay with not getting it, because technically that's personal property," right? So keep an eye on for those things. And that includes other things like security cameras that are installed, you know, things like that. You want to ask for those type of things, okay? Otherwise, you might end up not getting it, and then your client will blame you. Other disclosures here, like in who pays for that. You got your natural hazard disclosure form right there. Typically, the seller pays for that, so you want to mark that. You know, you're wondering who typically pays for this stuff. There's nothing that's set in stone. It's all negotiable. What I'm going to show you here is what normally happens, what's customary. So customarily, the seller pays for the natural hazard disclosure, right? Any of these disclosures are usually typically paid by the seller. The smoke alarm and water heater bracing, that cost is done to the seller. Any kind of government required point of sale inspections like they have in LA, typically the seller. You want to click on that, right? Any corrective actions, sometimes they do have to make repairs. You want to make sure that you select the box for the seller. This is very common, by the way, in Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, there's a pre-sale home inspection, and sometimes there's repairs that need to be done. You want to make sure that the seller is going to be responsible for that inspection, and that the seller is going to be responsible for those repairs. So you want to make sure that you click on those two things, right? You don't want to make it so that your buyer ends up being responsible for that, right? Escrow fees. You want to click on each pay their own fees, right? Because that's usually what happens. Each side pays for their own. So most of the time too, customarily, the escrow holder, you can fill in a specific escrow, but you can just leave it like this, because most of the time the seller chooses the escrow services, right? Same thing for title. It's usually the seller chooses for title, right? So here for escrow fee, I like to put buyer, seller. Well, it doesn't let you do that anymore. You can just click both, each pay their own fees. And here, owner's policy, you click on seller here. That's what's customary right there. Okay. Any county transfer tax or city transfer taxes typically paid for by the seller as well. Right. HOA fees, it's already set in seller. The HOA cert, it's the buyer. Any HOA transfer fees, click seller. Right. Any private transfer fees, click. I would just leave it like that. It's a seller or if check, so just leave it like that. It's already defaulted to the seller. Okay. Here in the office, you have your transaction coordinator fee. If you wanted to pass that along to your buyer, you could. Okay. You also have the real estate legal services. If you wanted to pass that along to your buyer, you could, right? So let's say I wanted to pass along my transaction coordinator fee. I could put that in here. Let's say my transaction coordinator fee is $5.95, right? TC fee. I would put that in there, and I'm selecting that my buyer is going to pay for that. The real estate legal services fee that we have here in the office. And you can pass it along to your buyer. Okay. Also, home warranty plans. Okay. Right here, you can ask for the seller to pay for a home warranty for your client. And so you would click that here. You can pick the home warranty company that you wanted, or you could leave it like seller's choice, right? If you want to put in like a maximum dollar amount. If you want to ask for specific coverages here, you just put that in right there, right? You can talk to the person that you're planning on getting this home warranty from, the representative there, and select the one that's appropriate for the house. Or if you're not asking for a home warranty, you can click on Buyer Waives Home Warranty Plan. Once again, whenever you have the buyer waive any kind of things like this, guys, you should always have it in writing. Yes, it makes their offer more desirable, okay? But you should also have it in writing that it says, hey, you know what? It's a good idea to get a home warranty, whether the seller pays for it or you pay for it. You should at least have it in writing before they just flat out waives it, because if it ever becomes an issue, right, you don't ever want them to be able to say, hey, my agent, recommended that I just waive that, and it's not important. You never want to have them be able to say that. So if they ever want to click this box because they want to make a more aggressive offer, make sure that you have it in writing that you didn't advise them of doing that, right? That you advise them that it's a good idea to get a home warranty, whether they pay for it or whether the seller pays for it, right? Because it protects them. It protects their investment at the very minimum. You don't want to be the person that recommends them to just simply waive that, right? But they could still do it, but you just want to have it in writing that you recommended that they didn't do that, okay? Those are your options right there, guys. Moving along to property addendum advisory, okay? A lot of times these check boxes, depending on what you filled in during the contract, might get filled in automatically, right? So if this was a tenant-occupied property and you selected the box earlier, it would have checked off this thing for you automatically and added this form automatically to your forms. Keep an eye on that. If this was a probate, you would select probate agreement, and then it basically makes this form part of the contract. If this was a manufactured home, you would select manufactured home, and it would add this form to your transaction, right? So depending on any of these things apply to you, you would select them, and then an additional disclosure becomes attached to this as well, okay? If this agreement is subject to any other terms, you can add an addendum here for any additional terms that you want to add to this transaction, right? If this offer is simply a backup offer, you would click here for backup offer, and then the backup offer addendum gets attached to it. If this property has a septic or a well or anything like that, or a propane, it's not connected, you would have this form attached to it as well, right? If this is a 1031 exchange, you would have one of these boxes right here clicked. Okay. Notice how you have the buyer's investigation advisory already attached to this, which is your BIA. That's part of this whole thing, is already attached. My wire fraud advisory is already attached. It's part of this whole form right here. The fair housing and discrimination is already attached. These are all attached by default, and you'll see them later on as you scroll through this thing. All right. The rest of this right there, for the most part, guys, There's nothing else really to fill in except these sections right here. Let me get to it. Moving along. All right, you want to make sure that your buyer initials these sections here. All right, so liquidator damages, very important, and this is only going to count if both buyer and seller sign off here. Okay, and it's basically stating that if the buyer, I'll read it to you. If the buyer fails to complete this purchase because of buyer's default, the seller shall retain as liquidated damages the deposit actually paid. So they can't collect more, right? And nothing more than their EMD is ever at risk, right? They can't sue for more, right? There's no other damages that they could possibly collect. It's limited to whatever the EMD is, all right? And so I think that's a good box for your buyers to select right there and the sellers to sign off. It protects them from any additional risks more than just the EMD. Okay. And also right here in this next box, it's important for buyers to sign off on that, and because if there's any kind of disagreements, right, if both parties agree that it needs to go to arbitration first, right, and that they're going to be bound to the results of arbitration. And it definitely avoids having to go to court. It avoids having to have a jury trial or anything like that, that obviously ends up costing a lot of money and time. Arbitration can be beneficial for both parties because it reduces the costs of litigation, of potential litigation, right? So something that I would recommend for your buyers, so make sure that they sign off right here, okay? Moving along to the last page of your RPA, right here is where your buyer signatures are. Right here, it allows the seller to accept your offer by simply signing, or they could accept your offer subject to a seller counteroffer, right? Or you're making this offer as a backup. And the sellers would sign here. By the way, right here, guys, this says offer not accepted. You know, sometimes if you're ever wondering if your offer got accepted, and you didn't get an answer, you can actually ask the seller, the listing agent, like, hey, can you have this page signed so that I know that my offer was presented, right? And so they would have to basically get their sellers to sign off right here that your offer was not accepted. And that gives you notice that your offer was at least presented, right? If you have any doubts as to whether your offer was presented or not. Especially when you didn't get the offer, right? When you didn't get your offer accepted. This is where you're signing off right here as your buyer's agent. You're going to sign off in this section here. The listing broker signs off there. Eventually, the escrow officer, if your offer does get accepted, the escrow officer is going to fill this in right here. This is your buyer's investigation advisory. This is a disclosure basically that's telling you, that's a notice that's telling your client all the reasons why they should get a home inspection. All right, it takes them 2 pages to tell them all the reasons why they should get a home inspection. And they sign off on that. So that is your buyer's investigation advisory. That's part of your RPA. Possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. So this is a disclosure that's letting them know that, hey, there might be an opportunity for there to be a dual agent. You know, this disclosure here is by default. Even when there's not a dual agency, it's going to be in there. There's a fair housing advisory, right? With regards to discrimination, it's letting them know that there's no discrimination in any type of properties for 1 to 4 unit properties, and it's unlawful. So it's letting them know about that. Letting them know that it's a good idea to get homeowners insurance and all the reasons why they should get one. It's just another disclosure, another warning that's added on to this, that it's part of your RPA. You just need to sign these off right here. Okay. Once this is done, guys, by the way, and you want to send this out for signature, right? You don't need to include your cover sheet or anything like that. Let's say I just wanted to send this out. We'll just click this off. Hopefully this helps you get your offers accepted. As always, I'm here to help out. Reach out to me. Wish you the very best. Take care. Bye-bye.